Hi everybody. So this is our last video lecture on plants, and for this one we're going to look at plant anatomy and physiology. We've really kind of been looking at that all along as we've been studying the structure of plants and looking at their different flowers and other parts, the leaves and everything. Those are actually organs, and so that is part of their anatomy, and then how those function, that's their physiology. So what we're going to do today, though, is put all of that together and learn more about how those structures are put together. And so what we're going to see in this video is that there are all multicellular organisms. We all start out with cells, and we're going to look at 3 different cell types in the plant. We'll see that cells work together to form tissues, and so there'll be different types of tissues, and then those tissues will also work together in different layers in order to form the organs. Okay, and so what you learn in this video about plants is going to set the stage. It's going to be the basis for the physiology when we look at other animals as well. So what you learn here will carry forward a little bit later. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay. So vascular plants, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on these as well so you could see them a little bit better. Right? So vascular plants, they're usually organized into an underground root system and an aerial shoot system. So the aerial system, again, everything above the soil, that consists of your stem, leaves, and then in flowering plants, it's the flowers and fruits. Right? So that's the shoot portion of the plant. Below ground is the root system, and the roots then branch extensively through the soil, and they can anchor the plant firmly in place, and they also absorb water and dissolve minerals that are in the soil. Okay. Back above, the leaves that are attached on the stem, they absorb the sun's light and the atmospheric carbon dioxide, and that gets used in photosynthesis. So then all of that can get distributed throughout the plant body. Okay? So during the evolution of plants, the roots and shoot systems specialized to obtain resources from the soil for the root system, and then from the air from the shoot system. Okay? Okay, so what we're going to look at now are the different cell types and the tissue types and how those make organs. And that's something, again, that's the basis of anatomy. And this is going to carry us forward when we look at animalia. So we are multicellular organisms. So that means that our bodies are made out of cells. Okay? But those cells then group together, and in different types of cells group together, and they form tissues. Okay? And so tissues, then these cells can kind of act as one unit in the form of a tissue, like your upper layer of your skin is epidermal tissue. Okay? And then the tissues, those can arrange in different layers, and they form organs. Okay? And the organs that we looked at already are the flowers parts, the stamens, the pistil, those kind of things. Well, that's all made of different types of tissues, which are made of different types of cells. So the plants are a little more less complex than the animalia, because here we're going to look at 3 types of cells. They're called parenchyma cells, Collancoma cells, and Sclerenchyma cells. Those cell types, they will group together and they form tissues. So those tissues are ground tissue, vascular tissue, and dermal tissue. And then those tissues, again, forming in different layers of different configurations, they form the organs of the plant. And the organs of plants are the roots, the stems, the leaves, the flower parts, even fruits. Those are all organs. Okay, and this picture just kind of gives you that idea of the different types of tissues that are found in the different organs. So that first one, the leaf, if we took a cross section of it and looked inside of there, you would see dermal tissue, you would see vascular tissue, you would see ground tissue. Okay, even the stem, You can see a different arrangement, the same three tissues, but they're just arranged differently. And then even down in the root, same three tissues, but they're arranged differently. So let's first go back and let's look at the different types of tissues, and then we'll also see what kinds of cells that are involved. Okay, so ground tissue system. The ground tissue system is composed of the three cell types: parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. And what distinguishes those three cell types are mainly the cell wall that is characteristic of that type. Okay, and so one thing to remember, and you might have if you've been in general biology, or you might have learned this in your high school biology, is that the cells of plants have a cell wall. Okay, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But this is a rigid portion surrounding the plasma membrane of a plant, and so it provides structure to the plant. Okay, animals' cells, we don't have cell walls because we move. We need to be kind of fluid and be able to move around. Whereas a plant needs to be a little more rigid so that it can grow tall and get to the sunlight. Fungi actually also have cell walls as well, but their cell walls are a little bit different from plants. But that's another lecture because we'll talk about fungi in the future. So the first type of cell to talk about is parenchyma, but we're going to also look at how those parenchyma cells group together to form a tissue. Okay, parenchyma tissue is a very simple tissue composed of those parenchyma cells, and it's actually a tissue found all throughout the plant body. Okay, and what we'll see is that it's got several functions. Some of the cells within there contain the chloroplasts, the organelles that contain the chlorophyll that allows for photosynthesis to occur. Some of them are able to store the products made from photosynthesis, and then some have a secretion ability. Okay, so this tissue, you consider it to be alive. All cells are considered alive, but they're metabolically active. Okay, sometimes though some cells to do their job, they actually are dead once they're doing their job, but that's not the case of these cells. Okay, and parenchyma cells have the ability to differentiate into other kinds of cells, and that means, so remember, you probably learned from general bio or from high school that all of our cells contain a complete copy of our DNA. But our cells all don't function the same way. And that's because only certain genes of the DNA get turned on in particular cells. Okay, and that's where differentiation comes in. So a parenchyma cell can differentiate and have a different function because different genes will actually be turned on inside of that cell. Sclerenchyma cells is another simple tissue, and it's mainly specialized for structural support. Okay, so some cells can be very variable in shape of this type, and we see that really common in the shells of nuts and in the stones of fruits. The fibers are very long and tapered at the end, and they can occur in clumps like in wood, and then the inner bark, and on leaf ribs or the veins of a leaf that we might see. So their primary walls, that means the first wall that they have, some only have first walls, some have a secondary wall. Parenchyma cells only have a primary wall. We'll see that other cells have a primary and secondary wall. So they're very strong and thick, and they have pits that allow for substances to exchange between the adjacent cells that are next to them. And this is a case where the mature cells, they do their best function when they're actually dead. So again, they're more specialized for this structural support. And many times we refer to them as fibers because of the long nature of these cells. So at maturity, because they're dead, they're actually lacking nuclei and cytoplasm. But again, what they're doing is they're performing more of a structural support. And then Collancoma cells, you see the longitudinal section to the left and a cross section to the right. Again, it's another elongated cell, but not as long as the Sclerenchyma cells. Their primary cell walls are unevenly thickened, and so you can kind of see that in the cross section there. Again, a simple tissue made of just this one cell type. They're more flexible, so it's still a structural tissue, but it provides some flexibility. So that would be in your non-woody plants. So you could kind of bend a stem down and it'll pop back up. But a woody plant, you can't really bend the stem. It's too strong. So at maturity, these cells are also alive. So here's a little more on the plant cell walls. So the primary cell walls that the parenchyma cells have, they have inside of them a carbohydrate substance called cellulose. I'm sorry, let me go back. There we go. They have a primary substance called cellulose. And also some hemicelluloses and pectin. These again are mainly carbohydrates. The thickened areas of the Collancoma cell walls, they contain large quantities of pectin, and they also have cellulose and hemicelluloses. Cellulose is something that we humans, we cannot digest. You need an enzyme called cellulase in order to digest this component of the plant, and that is not an enzyme that we humans make. So we're not able to digest cellulose, and so that ends up just moving through our digestive system, and we'll learn a little bit about that when we are in the animalia and we do learn about digestion. Okay, the secondary walls of Sclerenchyma cells, they become very rigid because they're also rich in lignin. If you remember lignin we spoke of earlier. And then they also still have the cellulose, hemicelluloses, and pectin. Okay, all but lignin, as I had mentioned, are carbohydrates, which are specifically are polysaccharides. So these are very big carbohydrate molecules. Lignin, though, is derived from amino acid, so a little bit different form of a molecule. And then the vascular system, the vascular tissue forms a system, and it's embedded in the ground tissue. And we're going to put all of this together in a minute. But its main function is to just transport materials throughout the plant. And we've already spoken about it because we talked about this. This, of course, is indicative of our vascular plants. They have xylem and phloem. And both of these tissues are just continuous throughout the plant body. Right? So if you remember that there's tracheids, and you see the tracheids over on the left side there. At maturity, they're actually dead, but their function, again, is to allow water to pass through the center of them. And then it has pits between adjacent tracheids so that water can actually also flow laterally between the tracheids as well. Okay, and any of that water will have minerals that are dissolved in there, and that will also run through the tracheids, and they also function as support for the plant as well. Okay, you can see vessel elements on the right side. Vessel elements are found in angiosperms, and they conduct water. They form the xylem of the angiosperms. And they are also dead at maturity. They do have some perforations, again, also between the cells, so that water can also move laterally between the cells, but mainly conducts it vertically through the plant, as well as the minerals that are dissolved in it. Okay. So, and to remember that vessel elements are more efficient than the tracheids in conduction. So that might be another advantage that the angiosperms have as well. All right. So now we know how water passes through. The other type of vascular tissue is the phloem. So phloem, remember, then conducts the sugars that are formed in photosynthesis, and sugar is a type of carbohydrate. So when the leaves are performing photosynthesis, that produces glucose. And so that needs to be distributed throughout the plant to use as energy. And then it may distribute it down to the roots in order to store it as starch, right? And the phloem also, as well, can provide structural support to the plant. Okay, so in flowering plants, we see the phloem is composed of all of the 4 cell types that we talked about. And the cells that comprise the phloem are called sieve tube elements. I'll show you a picture of those in a minute. And then there's also a companion cell that works together with the sieve tube element to help transport those carbohydrates throughout the plant. Okay? There are fibers that provide additional support, and these sieve tube elements are actually made out of modified parenchyma cells. Okay? So again, these are living cells in the phloem. Unlike the xylem, we said were dead, the tracheids and vessel elements, but the sieve tube elements are alive, but they do lack the nucleus and other organelles at maturity. And then at the end of their cells is a plate referred to as a sieve plate. And so you can see that pointed out right in the middle of the picture on the left side there. Okay, all of this helps to conduct the sugar that is in a solution and conduct it throughout the plant body. And this actually shows sieve tube elements in a squash. Oh, I almost forgot. And then there are the companion cells. The companion cells I mentioned, they're usually right alongside of the sieve tube elements, and they just kind of assist moving the sugars into and out of the sieve tube element, and then the sieve tube element conducts the sugars throughout the plant body. Okay. And so here are some drawings of xylem and phloem. So you can see the different types of, in the xylem there are the tracheids, that's an A, and the vessel elements in B. And then in phloem you can see the sieve tube element, and then also the companion cells on the lateral side of them, and shows you a little bit more the pits and the pores that are between them. All right, dermal tissue, the next type of tissue. Dermal tissue is there to provide a protective covering over plant parts. Now that term might sound similar to us. We have dermal tissue, which also provides a protective covering over us. So you can make some connections too with things that you're more familiar with, and that might help you remember. Okay, so in herbaceous plants, the dermal tissue is called the epidermis, right? And they come from 3 different, the cells are from 3 different plants that you see in the picture there. And what we're just trying to show you is that in different plants, the cells can take on a little bit of a different shape. But one of the things that's important to note here is that regardless of the shape, the epidermal cells fit really tightly together. And again, that's forming a protective barrier from the environment to the more delicate tissues inside of the plant. Okay? In a woody plant, they initially do produce the epidermis as they're growing, but then later on, periderm replaces the epidermis and becomes that outer bark. So one of the structures within the epidermis we've spoken about already as well are the stomata, right? And stomata are those pores to help facilitate the diffusion of gases, CO2 in, O2 out. And so plants need to do that in order to photosynthesize. Plants, to make sugars, need carbon dioxide plus water, and they can make glucose with that. And one of the waste products is oxygen, and so they release the oxygen out of the stomata. Okay? The rest of the epidermis has a waxy cuticle, and that helps to reduce water loss. So because of that waxy cuticle and that protection against the environment, well, the plants need a way to get the gases in, get the CO2 in and get the O2 out. So the stomata help to do that. And I'm going to show you the structure of the stomata in a little bit, but the two cells that are creating that pore are on the outside. Those two cells surrounding the pore are called guard cells, and those guard cells are able to open and close that pore. So I'm going to show you that in just a little bit, because now that we understand the different cell types and the different tissue types, now we're going to look at those in the context of the organs of the plant. So the first organ we'll look at are the leaves, right? And again, these three tissue types, they combine in order to form the leaf, and they combined in different ways in other organs to form the other organs, right? So leaves are really important to plants. Again, they're the site for photosynthesis in order to make the nutrition that they need in order to do the rest of, for their cells to be able to do the other jobs that they do to keep the plant alive. And then we like to eat those plants, and we can obtain glucose in that manner. Otherwise, we're not able to make glucose, or we have to eat other animals that eat plants as well in order to obtain the glucose. All right. So here are the parts of a leaf. This is actually using a geranium leaf as an example. So you can see the leaf itself, the flat, wide portion is referred to as the blade. The petiole is almost like the stalk that branches off the stem of the plant to hold the leaf out away from the plant. And so therefore, hopefully be able to get to more sunlight that way. Okay. And at the very base of the petiole and the stem, we've got the two stipules at the base of the leaf, and there's an axillary bud right at the base as well. Okay. So again, the function of the leaf is to gather sunlight necessary for photosynthesis. So in many plants, the leaf has a very wide, flat, broad surface to be able to absorb more sunlight that way. You increase the surface area, you can absorb more sunlight. Some leaves, though, when it gets too sunny, they're able to fold and curl up their leaf, and then that reduces the surface area. Some plants already have a reduced surface area because their leaves are more cylindrical, like a needle. Okay, but in whatever the case for that plant, the leaf structure is adapted for that optimal absorption of the light energy, as well as efficiently diffusing CO2 into the plant and oxygen out of the plant. And again, we'll look a little more closely at the stomata that are located on the leaf as well. Okay. So most cells in the upper and the lower epidermis actually lack the chloroplasts, that are used for photosynthesis, and they're more relatively transparent. Okay. And again, that's more for protection. The epidermal cells, then I mentioned before, secrete that waxy cuticle, which helps to prevent water loss. And we see that amount of waxy cuticle changes as we look at plants in different environments. If we're in the tropical rainforest, it's got a pretty thin waxy cuticle. Out here in Southern California, it's pretty thick. And these are things to help protect the cells from the dryness of the sun and the heat. Okay, again, the epidermis on the lower portion of the leaf, the underside of the leaf, will have stomata for gas exchange. And think about that. If the stomata were on the top of the leaf, where the sunlight is beating down and they were open to allow the gas exchange, it could also lose more water that way. So the leaf adaptation was to have the stomata on the under portion of the leaf, and that way they're not in direct connection with the heat and the sunlight coming down on them. So that provides a little bit an adaptation to keep the plant from losing too much water. Um, Let me show you a picture of all the tissues together that makes a leaf. Now, you don't have to reconstruct a picture like this. You don't even have to memorize the terms on here. But we're talking about leaves and their structure, and I wanted you to be able to see how the tissues come together. So there where you see the cuticle and the upper epidermis, remember that's part of the dermal tissue. And then over on the left side, you see that tube kind of running through with the red and the blue in it. That's those are the vascular bundles, allowing xylem and phloem to run through there. Those are forming the veins of the leaf. And remember, if we're looking at a monocot, those vascular bundles run parallel to one another. Okay, if we're looking at a dicot, those vascular bundles form more of a net-like pattern. Okay, and then inside in the ground substance, then we can see mesophyll and the substance that kind of fills in the center of the leaf and kind of holds the vascular bundles in place. And it also forms a little space within the leaf so everything isn't tightly packed in there, so that there's a little bit more distribution of fluids and airflow through there. Okay, the mesophyll cells are also are made of the parenchyma cells, and they're packed with chloroplasts, again loosely arranged with that space in there to just help with the gas exchange. Okay, they're also specialized for light capture, because again, this is where the photosynthesis takes place. And then notice at the very bottom of the leaf, at the bottom layer of the epidermis, or the cuticle, you can see stomata embedded in there. So the pore is the stoma, many stoma, one stomata, and the guard cells are the cells surrounding the pore, again, that can open and close that stoma. Okay, or one stoma, many stomata, sorry. Okay, and this is just what it would look like under the microscope. Again, you can point out the different tissue layers formed by the different types of cells. So now you can really see the different shapes of cells within there, which again are forming different tissue layers. And then the xylem and phloem forming the vein. The mid vein is that vein that goes right down the center of a leaf. Again, you don't have to memorize, be able to identify on a slide this leaf, but I just wanted to give you the whole picture of how cells produce tissues, and different tissue types then can arrange themselves in a different manner to produce an organ. Okay, and this organ happens to be a leaf, and we know that in different plants, leaves look differently, and that's because the tissues are arranged differently. So here's a leaf of a monocot, and you can see the difference in that one. This one is the leaf of a conifer, a needle. Remember, their leaves are more needle-like. And sometimes people have a hard time understanding, why is that a leaf? How can it photosynthesize? Well, it is more tubular. Remember that our conifers tend to live in drier climates. We see them many times in at elevation where it's much drier, and they survive through the winters where there's less water available. And so in order to be able to survive those really dry environments, their waxy cuticle is even thicker, and then the stomata are sunken lower into the leaf. And so those two structural adaptations really help to enable pine trees such as this one just to retain its needles throughout the winter. So this is why we call those trees evergreen, because they do not drop their needles. They don't drop their leaves. They're able to maintain them throughout the winter because they can resist the drying that would otherwise occur. Whereas angiosperm trees, they tend to drop their leaves in the winter. Sometimes hard to see that in Southern California, but we still do have examples of that here, because we don't have very cold winters. We usually have available water. So winter is really characterized with very dry, it's got low humidity, but also remember that the soil freezes too. So there's not a lot of available water to draw up through the soils. So that thick needle or the relative, the roundness of the needle really reduces surface area again to prevent water from evaporating out because there's just not as much water down at the soil. So nice adaptations there for dryness. Okay, let's talk about those stoma and how we're able to open and close them, or let's talk about those stomata and how they're able to open and close. And it really just has to do with pumping ions into the guard cells. And there in picture number 3, you can see potassium being pumped into the guard cell, and the inside of the guard cell becomes positive, and therefore chloride follows because that's a negative ion. Then the inside there becomes what we would call hypertonic. It has a lot of solute in it. The potassium chloride is a solute, it's a salt. And when things are very salty, it draws water toward that area as well. So that cell then fills up with water, becomes very plump, and then that causes the guard cells to kind of bend outward. Think of like when, to me, it looks like when you blow up a cylindrical balloon and it kind of curves, like if you're going to make balloon animals out of that, and it kind of curves. So that just opens up the guard cells, and they curve outward, and that opens up the pore on the inside. Okay? We say that when the cell is full of water, it becomes turgid, Turgid, turgid. Okay? And again, this is an active pump that's pumping the chloride into those guard cells. So the cell is expending a little bit of energy to be able to do that. Okay? For the closing of the stomata, here, when the leaf, then all day it's been producing sugars, right? Then the inside of the leaf becomes more what we call osmotically active, meaning then that water wants to move out of the guard cells toward the area where there's sugar. Now there's more solute in the surrounding cells. So as evening approaches, then the sugar, or I'm sorry, before evening approaches, so as sugars are being produced, then the water moves out of the guard cell, and the guard cell just kind of withers and closes up. Okay. Then I do have in there, as the evening approaches, sucrose is converted back into starch, and the water leaves by osmosis again, and the pore closes. All right. So we've been talking about water moving through xylem, and so now we need to know, well, how does that happen? How does water actually move through? And if you think of our own bodies, our water, we distribute it through our body through our blood vessels, and we have a heart, a pump that pushes the blood throughout our body to be able to do that. Well, plants don't do anything like that. Plants do move water throughout their body through a process called transpiration. And really, this is what we're doing is water, which is in high concentration in the soils. That's where water starts, and it gets drawn in through the roots. And then at the leaves, at the outer surface of the leaves, they're in the dry air where there's no water. So there's a low concentration there. So really, water just moves, gets conducted through the plant tissues, through the xylem, based on concentration gradient. High in the soil, low in the air, water's going to move from the area of high concentration to low. And it does that based on what's known as the tension cohesion model. Okay? Water molecules, H2O, they like to stick to one another. That's cohesion. So if one water molecule moves into the root because there's less water in the root than there is in the soil, that's the tension being referred to, Then when one water molecule moves, another water molecule wants to stick to it. That's the cohesion part. And it moves along with it. And another water molecule sticks to that one. And it therefore keeps moving through the plant tissues in that manner, because eventually everywhere above that water molecule that has just entered, there's less water above it, because at the end of the line at the leaf, remember that leaf is exposed to the air, and where there's little water there, even in a humid environment, there's less water there than there would be in the soil. So therefore water moves, this is what we call by transpiration, and it just kind of moves throughout the plant tissues in that manner. Okay, so 99% of the water a plant absorbs from the soil actually gets lost by transpiration. And it's again because of those open stomata. So again, the plant can minimize some of that loss by closing those stomata. Okay, and another way that a plant can minimize the loss, again, is by wilting. You can see that picture at the top. The plants are nice and firm and open. Again, that's called turgid. And then at the bottom, they look wilted. Well, they're not dying. It's just that there's less water moving through. And then when they wilt and they kind of bend downward like that, there's less surface area coming in contact with the heat of the sun. And so transpiration actually slows down in those moments. So transpiration of water through the plant. Okay. There's another process referred to as gutation. This process actually usually occurs in low-growing plants at night. Okay, so there are special structures at the vein endings that can force water out, because at night transpiration can become negligible, but the soil moisture can be very high, and so the water then can really, or the plant can fill up with water, and so the plant can, the xylem at the ends can actually force that water out. The stomata tend to be closed at this point, but the water does continue to move into the roots by osmosis, by that high concentration toward the area of low concentration. So when at night, when there's less heat, and so there's less of an osmotic pressure moving through, again, the xylem can actually force this water out. So many times in the morning when you see water on the tips of plants, especially low-growing plants, that's not dew, moisture from the atmosphere. That's the plant actually pushing moisture out. Okay, those are the leaves. Let's look at another structure, the stem structure. Again, these are made out of the different tissue types that we've been looking at. This picture here is of the giant sequoias. They're the most massive trees on Earth, and their stems can grow to about 250 feet high or even more. So they're pretty spectacular. They're up in Northern California. If you ever have a chance to go stand next to a sequoia, you should do it. So remember that in a vascular plant, then the stems link the roots and the leaves together. And so we just talked about the movement of fluid through the plant stem, but also the sugars move through the stem as well, through the phloem. Stems can also form a range of vines. They can be the vines that you see to these massive tree trunks. Sorry. So there's very many different types of stems and different sizes and shapes that they can take. And if they're more soft, we refer to those as herbaceous plants. Again, you can bend the stem and it won't have a lot of resistance. It'll bounce back. Or they can be woody with very hard tissues and bark. And that's like our trees, and that's where we get our wood from. Okay, so the functions are mainly for support for the leaves and the other reproductive structures. Again, we've talked about this already. They have the internal transport of water and dissolved minerals from roots to the other plant parts, and then they also transport those sugars as well throughout the plant parts. Okay. And we can get production of new living tissue, and so we get new buds that come off of the stem that may then form new leaves and things like that. Alrighty, so this picture here is just kind of an overview of the transport in vascular plants. Again, xylem is explained on the right side where the blue is moving, so that shows the conduction of the water from the roots. And again, the water is carries the dissolved minerals coming from the soil. So again, once it enters through the roots, then the water and the minerals are transported upward in the xylem to the stems, the leaves, the flowers, the fruits, the seeds, all throughout. And again, no pumps are doing that. It's actually mostly moving through that process of transpiration. So most water that a plant absorbs is transpired through the stomata and into the atmosphere. On the other side is the translocation of the dissolved sugar that the leaves are making, and they can actually move upward or downward. It just gets transferred throughout the plant itself. And movement is driven largely by natural physical processes, and we're not going to get really detailed into that. If you want to learn more about how fascinating how plants function, you should take a botany class. I really encourage you to do that. Okay, but I think what's interesting too, remember that plants seem to defy gravity because the water is moving from the roots up toward the leaves. But again, that process of transpiration, because of the properties of the cohesive properties of water and the osmosis that occurs down at the roots, it can be done. Alrighty, and this just to kind of tie everything together, again showing that tension cohesion model, and then also kind of showing the different tissue types within the leaves and within the stem, and how water can move up through there. All right, that's it for plants. Thanks everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have a new appreciation for plants, or better appreciation from plants, maybe if you already had it. Thank you.